So monorepo or multi-repo, putting all my code into one place, or using microservices and follow the single responsibility principles. I'm sure that if you're a developer, you all ask yourself the same question over and over when you're about to start your new project. And I know I did when I started my company, JIT, about a year and a half ago. So, should I manage all my code base into a single repository, allowing to refactor easily if needed and having a common culture among my teams? Or should I rather favor the ability to have independent deployments and versioning and more autonomous work in each team, who can decide in which language they want to code or which web framework they're more comfortable with? So the monorepo versus the multi-repo seems really like a never-ending debate with its pros and its cons. And what about CI? On one hand, I have a single CI file for my whole application, and on the other, I have one file per repository that I need to remember to add every time that I create a new repository, and then manage with obviously a lot of duplicated code. So this seems like a really a heartache if I were to decide with the with a, whether I want to do the multi-repo approach or the mono-repo, and if I'm going with the multi-repo approach. But what if there was another way? So I'm David Melamed. I'm the co-founder and CTO at JIT, the continuous security platform for developers. And when I started my company, I faced the same challenge. I did not want to remind everyone to add CI when they create their new repo. I wanted microservices that would allow me to scale, to have teams owning particular services, and I didn't want the overhead of managing CI files all over. So creating a new repo using some templates that would add CI right away may be a solution, but it's only partial because I didn't want to update all my existing repos every time I decide to change my CI pipeline. And so I thought, what if I could have a central place where I can keep my CI pipeline configuration and find a way to trigger it from every repository? How would it look like? So basically, what I would need to do is the ability to listen to every PR using some backend, which would trigger the CI pipeline automatically with the relevant context in order to clone the branch and run my test on it. Um, that seems easy enough, right? So let's take a more concrete example with GitHub as a place where we can store our code, and GitHub Actions as a CI. But of course, it can work with other setups. So let's say I have a GitHub organization with a repository called A, and when I open a PR, GitHub automatically sends some events like PR opened to my webhook listener. And this listener leverages a feature of GitHub called dispatch workflow, which trigger a GitHub action workflow that I stored in my central CI repository in my GitHub organization. That should run all the tests that I need on my PR. Like, this is simple, right? At least in theory. So why do I need to implement this? Well, I need to create a GitHub application because I need to get access to the GitHub API. And I will need to be able to register and receive events about open PRs. Also, I need to use the GitHub API in order to trigger some remote workflow. So for that, I need the GitHub API. Now, I also need to write some backend for my webhook listener. And here I picked Python as a language. And I wanted, because I have a lot of APIs, I want to use async libraries. So for that, I used IO HTTP and the IO HTTP DevTools. And for everything that's related to GitHub, I didn't want to right away call GitHub APIs, so I use the wrapper. I use the Git Hub library. And finally, since I want to start by making sure it works locally, then I'm also using ngrok, and that's giving me a public URL for local development. Okay, so now what about creating the GitHub application? Well, first of all, I need to define the webhook URL. This will point to the public URL that ngrok will give me. And also I need to define a webhook secret in order to verify that the call that I'm getting is genuine. I also need to define a few permissions. First of all, I need read and write on actions because I want to be able to trigger remotely some workflow. I also need read only on contents because in my CI pipeline, I will need to be able to clone my code. I also need some pull request read only in order to be able to get the details of the pull request while I'm subscribing to events, the pull request in order to get all the pull request events to my webhook. And finally, I have also the check read and write, and we'll get to that later. Finally, I have some local environment variables that I need to define. I have the GitHub app ID, the webhook secret, and the certificate that the application is giving me. All of that I need to set up as environment variable in my local setup in order to be able to use my backend. So enough talk. Let's see how it looks like. We'll recode. So let me show you, first of all, PyCharm. Okay, I have here a simple file. It's a main file, right? Let's start with the end, actually. And here you can see that this is how I define my my application, my web application, really simple. And I need to add some routes. So I have here only one route. It's the webhook route. And here, basically what I'm doing is I'm getting my secret from my local environment, and I'm dispatching events, meaning that every time we'll get an event, I will call for these different coroutines. Now, what I did here is that I defined these two coroutines using the same function because I want to be able to handle the open PR and reopen PR if I close and reopen the PR with the same code without duplication. So what does the handle PR do? Well, it's getting the installation ID. That's my way of authenticating myself. Once the GitHub application is installed, I have a unique identifier. That's the installation ID. And here I'm defining the client payload. This is what I will send to my CI pipeline because I need to tell the central pipeline basically the original repo and the details about the SHA, what commit exactly do I want to clone. So everything here is detailed. And at the end, I also need the token that I can generate for my installation ID and the certificate that I have on my machine. Here I'm defining the target. This is the target file that I want to trigger. This is ci.yaml. We'll see that in a minute what's in this file. And here I'm just calling one API of GitHub in order to be able to trigger this workflow remotely. So this is the code. Let's see an example. Well, we'll see the example in a few seconds. Let's see it's running first of all. So I will come up with my terminal. First of all, here you can see that, let me make it bigger. You can see here that I'm running ngrok. Ngrok is giving me the ability to have a public endpoint, and it's pointing back to localhost 8000. This is the place where I'm running my local backend. And this is the code that I want to start here also. And the way I'm starting it is just by doing a div run server. Okay, now my backend is running. Let's put it aside here. And now let's see in the browser what happens when I open a PR. So first of all, for those who never created a GitHub application, this is how it looks when you create an application. This is where you define your webhook URL. Okay. I also had my secrets. I downloaded my certificate, and these are the permissions that I gave here, as I showed previously. So I have a read write here for actions, read write for checks is for afterwards, contents, and I'm also at the end here subscribing to the pull request events. Now let's see how it works. I have here a sample GitHub organization. It's called Centralized CI, and I have two repositories. I have my central CI repository that we'll see in a minute, and I have a test repository. So let's look what's in this simple one. You'll see that I have only one file, a main, very simple, a simple Flask application, nothing in it, right? And as you can see, I didn't define any CI. In my central CI, what I have here, I have GitHub workflows, and I have two workflows. Let's take the first one. This is the one we want to use right now. Okay, as you can see here, I'm defining here my workflow dispatch. This is the client payload that I will get as part of the events. And this is what I want to do. I want to set a Python. I want to check out my code. And here, I just want to run Fleck8 on my code. Right? So simple enough. Let's just get back one sec here in the file and make sure that we're using the CI0, the CI, the one, that's the one that we'll use afterwards. Let me just restart my my service, restarting automatically. Okay, so now I just want to verify that everything is working. So what I will do is I'm going here to my test repo, and I will just change something here in my README. Open a simple branch, create a PR, and let's see what happens. So first of all, here I'm getting the call automatically. That works, meaning that I have a connection with GitHub. GitHub knows to send me URLs. Now let's see. I don't see here anything. What happens here? This is the central repo. Let's make it a little bit smaller so that we can see the menu also. Because what I want to see here is one sec, the actions. Okay. And in actions, one sec. Okay, just trying to play with the size of my screen here. Just one sec. I need to click on actions. Okay, what happens here in actions is that I have this simple actions that was triggered a few seconds ago. And as you can see, everything worked. And I don't have any issue here in my Fleck8. So just to go back a little bit.
As you can see here, it started a few seconds ago. And if I'm checking here, what checkout did it do? It really checked out. It really checked out my centralized CI test. Okay, so I managed to trigger remotely my CI workflow. That's great, but I have still some issue, right? Let's go back here. And the issue I have is that I have no visibility on my PR. I only managed to trigger my workflow, but it didn't update my PR, which is really annoying because I wouldn't be able to block any issues in my PR. So what can I do here? Basically, what I want to do is something like that. I would like to be able to use the checks so that I will be able to see that the results of my linter and my CI pipeline in general into my PR. The problem is that that would be super easy if the workflow was running in the same repo, but it runs in a central repo. So I cannot get that automatically provided by GitHub. What do I need to do? Well, um, what I would need is basically the ability to create those checks remotely using some API. So it would look like that. Once I trigger the job, I would need somehow the CI to report the outcome to the backend, which would update the status at the end. A little bit more in details, I would need the following. I would need first, when I check out my repository, to create a check so that I will get some initial visibility something is running, and then run my linter, and at the end, update my check. That would look like that in a more general way. So here I'm checking out my code, and then I'm telling my backend that I need to create a check. This will call the GitHub API in order to create a check. And then I'm running my linter. And once the linter is done, I'm calling back my backend in order to tell GitHub to create a check using the API. And now the check is updated. Do you want to see that in practice? Let's do it. So let's get back to PyCharm. This was the original code, right? And so now I would like to make it a little bit more complicated with the second code I just showed. This is the second file. Let's make it a little bit bigger. Okay, what's new here? First of all, I have new routes. The first route I have is the check one, which allows me to create some check. Basically, what I'm doing here is that I'm using the payload that I'm getting from the call in order to call the GitHub API and create the check. And I have the second one, which is update check, which is somewhere here. This is the function that creates the check itself. And here I can update my check by having the check run ID. So that's the backend part. So here, as you can see, I'm getting everything from the payload, and I'm getting the details of the run of the check, and then I can update the check with the status completed, and the conclusion that comes from the payload itself. Okay, and so how does it look like in the CI itself? What do I need to change? Well, this is an example. So here you can see that after that I'm setting a Python, I'm creating my check by just posting some curl request to my backend, and I'm getting back my check run ID. This is important because I need that afterwards when I want to update it. This is the way that I can save that into some environment variable inside GitHub Action in order to be able to reuse that between steps. After that, the same thing that I did before, I'm checking out my code. I'm running a linter, and then I have this piece of code. So
I want to be able to save also as environment variable inside GitHub action the result of my checks. So this is in case of failure. I want to be able to say failure in one of success. And this is something that I'm getting automatically from GitHub Actions, because Flick 8 will return a failure if it doesn't, if you find some issues with my code. And at the end, once I will get the results, I'm running that always, no matter what, if I have a failure or a success. And I'm running this second call request, the pull request to my backend in order to be able to update my check. Okay, so let's see how it looks in action, in real time. First of all, I will change my backend here, and I use the new one, the one that is updated with the update of the check. And now what I will do is create another PR. But this time what I will do, let's do it here. I will go to test. What I will do here, I will change my main. Well, let's see first of all if the visibility works. I will just change my README like I did before. I will create this branch. I will create this repo, and let's see if I have some visibility here. First of all, I can see that I'm getting a post request. And now let's see if it starts to run here. So yeah, I have a post check. I can see here that my linter starts to run. That means that the GitHub Actions was able to create a check, and it's really, really fast. And now I can see that my linter is working. At least I can see that if I have a success, it's working. Let's make sure the linter is well working and the status is updated as it should. So what I will do now is mess up with the code itself and the indentation. Basically adding some more lines here. It should be enough. So here I'm creating another pull request, and let's see what happened. So I'm getting my first webhook. When I'm getting my webhook, what I'm doing is I'm triggering my my CI pipeline remotely. This takes usually a few seconds for GitHub to start the call. Here I'm getting my check, so the check is now created, and the result is I have my second, and it's failing. Now, if I'm getting into the details, not here, what I will do is that let's go back to the centralized CI here in my actions, and I can see the details, what happened. So it looks like I still need to do something to get the results back. The link is not working right now, and this is something that I will need to fix. But basically, as you can see here, I can see the results in my centralized CI. So let's go back here. What you saw until now is that we managed to create a centralized CI and reflect the status inside the original repo. But there's a couple of things that I didn't show and I didn't talk about. First of all, where you can find the code if you want to play with it, make it better. As you can see, there are some improvements that can be done there. The code is available freely on GitHub. It's a public repo, and this is the URL. And now a few other topics that I didn't talk about. First of all, what are you doing with dependencies, like a database, for example? Well, in that case, we would need to add the database into the central CI. So we could think of a way for defining some dependencies inside each of the repo
And if this dependency, like the database, is present, based on this configuration, trigger that and start the database into the centralized CIs when it's required. It can be also part of the payload that I'm sending to the central pipeline. The second thing that is interesting to think of is, what if I have different sets of tests between between my microservices? Not all microservices are created equal, and so what happens if, for example, I have some microservice that requires different tests than others? I would think that in that case, it's kind of the same thing, because you can define some configuration inside the repo. Let's say if you have more tests, so you can have additional tests that you would define in some specific repo, and then in the centralized one, you can grab this file and make sure that you read the configuration and run some additional tests based on the flags. And finally, as you could see, right now there's no real way to see the finding easily, because you need to go back to the actions in the centralized CI repository in order to see the findings, which is quite annoying, because every time something is failing, then you would need to go back to the centralized CIs, find the right one, and then be able to see the details. So what could be done there? Well, basically at JIT, we thought about it, and we improved the version that you saw. And what we did is to post as comments the results of the findings into the PR itself. So this is a platform that is centered on security. So here I'm showing you an example of what we did for security. Basically, what is running in some tool here. It's some SAS tool that's checking misconfiguration for infrastructure as code, and as you can see, the results of the test of something that was running is posted as some kind of peer review that you would see in the peer itself. That allows developer at JIT to not have to go into each of the um, central checks in order to understand exactly what is failing. Um, and so, as you can see, this started with something that is simple, and we can evolve that with some more complex code. We started with something that is really straightforward, with actually one call. We're listening to a PR, and we're calling back the trigger of this central pipeline, and then we make it a little bit more complex, adding into the pipeline the creation of the check. And as I just said, we can make it even more complex than that. The major advantage of doing that, especially for security, is that um, I don't need to think every time a developer is creating a new repository, because I'm listening to all the PRs of all the repos. So every time there's a new repo, as long as my GitHub application is installed at the organization level, well, basically, every PR is triggering this central pipeline. And so if you define some security tests inside the pipeline, in addition to the basics like the linter and your unit test and your integration test, then you don't need to think about it, and developers don't need to think about it every time they're creating a new repo, not to forget to add the CI configuration. And so, as I said here, we at JIT are running those security tests as a central in our central pipeline, and this is also something we are offering our user. So, if you're intrigued, don't hesitate to visit the website to get early access. And if you have any question regarding how to run this in your own environment, don't hesitate to contact me at david at jit.io. And thank you again for your attention. If you have any question right now, I can also answer into the chat or something.